Wow, this is a full house tonight. This is great. Good evening, everyone. My name is Sherry Booth, and I'm the Associate Vice President of Philanthropy and Alumni Engagement, and I'm also a proud Trent alum. So, like many of you students here, you will soon be Trent alum. I've worked at Trent for over 30 years, and I'm absolutely passionate about everything we do here. So I'm so glad you've joined us this evening. As we gather in the new student center, a fairly new student center, next to the beautiful swirling waters of the Otonabee River, we recognize the Mississauga called this river Odonabazizi, which means the river that beats like a heart. How appropriate that it runs through our campus, which sits on the treaty and traditional territory of the Mississauga Anishinaabeg. We are grateful to the First Nations of this region for sharing their knowledge and working with us to tell their story. On behalf of Trent University, it is my honor to welcome you to the annual Elaine Stavro Distinguished Visiting Scholar in Theory, Politics, and Gender Studies lecture. At Trent, we strive to be strong partners, enhancing the community and the culture of Peterborough. Sharing knowledge, such as we're doing this evening, is just one way we give back to our community. And this lecture is part of the university's Community Speaker Series that hosts annual lectures on a wide variety of topics. Our community, and in turn, helps to enhance the university and the student experience in many ways, including philanthropy. In times of increased financial pressures for many of our students, the impact and importance of giving back is truly appreciated. Tonight's lecture is provided thanks to the generosity of Dr. Elaine Stavro. Established in 2011, the Elaine Stavro Distinguished Visiting Scholar in Theory, Politics, and Gender Studies was created to enhance Trent's reputation for our interdisciplinary approach to teaching, learning, and research, and to introduce Trent students and community members to leading speakers who tackle important issues that challenge us today. On behalf of Trent University and the Peterborough community, thank you to Dr. Elaine Stavro for your vision, dedication, and the legacy that you have left Trent University. I'd like to invite you to the stage to say a few words of welcome. Thank you.
Greetings. As the underfunding of Ontario universities proceed apace, the university is increasingly forced to seek private support to make up the shortfall. This has meant pursuing fundraising and marketing. While some people have favored having their name in bricks and mortar or associated with scientific life-saving projects, I wanted to help mitigate that part of the university that is often neglected, research in humanities and social sciences. As our teaching complement has continually been eroded and funding for non-scientific research gets more difficult, since the Ontario government favors STEM, science, technology, engineering, and medicine, I hope in a small way to have obviated this crisis by bringing a distinguished scholar to Trent to share in their research. I remember being struck by the French educational system. Members of the community sat and listened attentively to the public lectures of Roland Barthes, Michel Foucault, Lévi-Strauss, and Jacques Derrida. Peterborough isn't Paris, but the insights of an intellectual in Anglo-American culture are not valued as they are in Europe. In fact, the intellectual is often spurned for producing abstract, idiosyncratic, and useless knowledge, or alternatively for believing they capture the true and just for all. Such rhetoric should be avoided, yet I still hold out a place for the public intellectual. As I've personally been a member of both the schools of humanities and social science, and now they're one, I have been struck by the misconceptions that inform our perceptions of each other. The humanities faculty imagine social scientists spend their time engaged in empirical work or analyzing data, to disclose the real world, measuring happiness or establishing cause and effect chains to predict future outcomes. The social scientists, for their part, imagine that humanities faculty produce knowledge that is abstract, symbolic, possibly creative, but are skeptical of their ability to improve the human condition or further human understanding. How we make sense of the world we live in is not going to be achieved by analysis of the real world or social structures alone. Efforts to explore the symbolic and technologized worlds of subjectivity and the specificity of current events will be furthered by exchanges with cultural and literary theorists, philosophers, and historians. In our dark and confusing times, where impact, metrics, and practicality measure research accomplishments, we should take heed not to buy into calls for immediate impact. The intent of this endowed lectureship is to foster conversations and collaboration between the humanities and social sciences, producing knowledge that is meaningful and furthering understanding and encouraging thoughtfulness. Finally, this endowment was established to support women, researchers, scholars, and academics who aren't sufficiently recognized in the Academy. Apart from Jacques Rancière, a notable exception, all of the 14 speakers have been women. On that note, let me introduce Janice Feng from the Politics Department, who will speak on behalf of Catherine Kellogg. Sorry.
Good evening, everyone, and thanks for being here. Before we start, I would like to thank Sherry for the land acknowledgement, and I would also like to add that we're here gathering on the treaty lands that were concluded in the Williams Treaties, and I want to emphasize that as settlers, our commitment to respect and responsibility and renewal to indigenous peoples. So Dr. Catherine Kellogg is professor of political science at the University of Alberta in Edmonton, located on the Treaty 6 territory, where I'm from and where the weather is normal. Her research mainly concerns the relationship between law, sovereignty, and violence. She is the author of Law's Trace from Hegel to Derrida, as well as many journal articles. Her current work engages contemporary continental philosophy, moral philosophy, and psychoanalysis to think through and about the pressing problems of racial capitalism and prison abolition. So as you know, the legal abolition of slavery in the 19th century in the US did not end racial capitalism, which morphed into forms of anti-Black domination, including rigid racial segregation, launching Jim Crow, as well as mass incarceration and prison labor. In fact, the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution codified that neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist, it declares, except as punishment for a crime. So many activists and intellectuals, including W.E.B. Du Bois, have argued that this provision effectively allows forced labor in prisons and incentivizes the state to mass incarcerate predominantly Black and also Hispanic and other racialized peoples. So it is in the condition of continuous racial capitalism that contemporary abolitionist movements took place. Alicia Garza, who was one of the co-founders of the Black Lives Matter movement, in her declaration writes that, when we say Black Lives Matter, we're talking about the ways in which Black people are deprived of our basic human rights and dignity. It is an acknowledgement Black poverty and genocide is state violence. It is acknowledgement that 1 million Black people are locked in cages in this country, in the US. 1/2 of all people in prisons or jails is an act of state violence. It is an acknowledgement that Black women continue to bear the burden of a relentless assault on our children and our families, and that assault is an act of state violence. This is all to say that abolition is a pressing political need and demand. And at the same time, scholars have been grappling with ways of understanding and actualizing abolition at the present. So without further ado, let's welcome Dr. Kellogg in giving her talk entitled The Future of Abolition.
This is a very tall podium. I'm fairly small. I might have to move around. I don't know. Hello, everybody. I'm thrilled to be here. I'm thrilled to be here as the distinguished visiting scholar in theory, politics, and gender studies. I'm going to have to figure out glasses on or glasses off. I think it's off. I want to first thank my hosts, Elaine, Stavro, of course, but also Joanne Sokolowski, Taylor Stark, obviously Janice. I love the fact that you said where the weather is normal. And other members of the Trent community who have been so welcoming and made this process easy and pleasant. Am I too close to the mics? What's happening? Oh, I'm good. Okay. So I come tonight from Treaty 6, and I'm glad to be here on the traditional territory of the Mishisagits Anishinaabeg. I'm not too far from where I grew up in Cornwall, Ontario, and in Belleville, Ontario, and Peterborough is home to many relatives of mine, aunts and uncles and cousins. So for me, this landscape looks like home. So I'm glad to feel like I'm kind of home, although I agree that I prefer the weather in Edmonton. I offer this acknowledgement of the land, not just in gratitude for being here, but also as a statement of solidarity with any and all experiencing dispossession, land theft, and genocide around the world. So let me start by telling you first, who am I and how I come to the question of abolition. For the last 20 years, my teaching and my research have been at the intersection of law, human rights, and the humanities. My first major research project was a book-length study of the relationship between deconstruction and law, in which I made the argument that deconstruction is actually an important legal method. My next research project explored more practical problems of questions of justice and citizenship in light of the problem of national state sovereignty. As Hannah Arendt pointed out 70 years ago, because the fate of human rights and the nation state are tied together, in the absence of any legitimate supranational or state institution, there's no political institution to protect human rights. So this research moved me towards teaching and writing about the philosophical foundations of human rights and work that explores the relationship between law, politics, war, policing, and violence. So I'm now looking at the ambivalent power of the state, not just to protect, but also, of course, to punish. And so a new object of study, what I'm calling cruel punishment. So that brings me not just to the literature on human rights, but also to the literature on prisons and abolition studies. Let's see. Oh, look, it works. Abolition studies are many things, but at the most kind of macro level, it's the study of the project that has for hundreds of years been gathered under the umbrella of abolition. The various movements around the world that sought to abolish slavery, the death penalty, prisons, the police, and more recently have sought to include in that list the call for the abolition of oil and fossil fuels, of borders, of property, capital, the family. The list is very long. These are iterative processes. Each place and time does its best to articulate or self-clarify the struggles and the wishes of its own age. But each version of abolitionism self-consciously uses the term abolition to indicate its debt to those former struggles. This is a project that leapt into the mainstream a few years back when calls to abolish the police, in particular, came to have a flashpoint with the Black Lives Matter protests around the world. But it's probably most widely known through the project to abolish prisons. The work being done by critics not just of the practice of punishing by putting people in cages, but also to bring to light the historical roots of prisons. This is work that has become, in some senses, almost mainstream. You can think of Anna Duvern's 2014 documentary 13 that links the prisons to slavery in the US, or even the fairly stodgy Maclean's magazine, which declared prisons to be Canada the new residential schools. The number of things that abolitionists do is quite amazing. Many work directly with the incarcerated as allies in political work, lots do education work, many do policy work with governments, private corporations, First Nations, or international organizations, and there are many critics and activists making links between abolition and other struggles for social justice. It's a pretty big umbrella and it's a big tent. Even though, as Angela Davis has declared, we find it very difficult, almost impossible, to imagine a world without prisons, those working in the area of prison abolition are not simply looking to break every incarcerated person out of prison, but are looking to understand the historical roots and wrongs of the political project to build prisons in the first place. They largely see prisons as an attempt, albeit a brutal one, to find solutions to various social problems. And they're working to solve those problems, in this case, most clearly the problem of poverty, in other ways. Abolition, in other words, is the name for a project that is not just about the destruction or canceling out. It's also about building the design for the future as the very project of that canceling. So abolition as a politics is always already about a certain future, a call for a future on the basis of an understanding of the past and the present. Most political projects of abolition, from the movement to abolish prisons to the police, have situated themselves in the black and red radical traditions. And in that sense, they seek not only to abolish oppressive institutions, but to rethink the whole world for whom cruel institutions make sense. Now, this is a quote from Alexis Pauline Gumbs from her book, Abolition Now. What if abolition isn't a shattering thing, not a crashing thing, not a wrecking ball event? What if abolition is something that sprouts out of the wet places in our eyes, the broken places in our skin, the waiting places in our palms, the tremble holding in my mouth when I turn to you? What if abolition is something that grows? I think that this quote gets at the ways in which abolition is a project that also recognizes that what is most proximate to us, our desires, our bodies, our skin, our sexuality, our ideas and thoughts about ourselves, our individuality, who we understand ourselves to share our lives with whom we make meaning, that this is at the core of what the logic of the prison aims at destroying. In her lovely new little book, Abolitionist Intimacies, Elle Jones shows that it's precisely the intimacies that are invaded, lost, rendered impossible, dismembered, and distorted in prison. But she also enjoins us to notice that these intimacies, that love, care, meaning, and hope, happen under these conditions anyway. And this is also at the core of abolition work. So as I've said, built right into the project for abolition, there is always a future, one that is demanded and fought for. And this is actually a future which will change who we are, what we might dream, what we might want. Jack Halberstam says this really nicely. Who we are before the break is different from who we are in the break, and that in turn is different than who we will be after the break. Thinking about abolition involves reimagining the narrative structure of what we feel puts the limit on social change. It involves, as I hope I can show, a new narrative structure, one that might be said to take its inspiration from the poetry of the future. Abolition is, in Ruth Wilson Gilmore's words, a constant becoming. The taken for grantedness of carceral logics necessitates unlearning the limitations we face in its continuation. So abolition is also a project of collective self-making. The project of abolition then embodies or carries with it a theory of social change, a theory of the futurity, I suppose you could say. I'm currently working on a monograph entitled Sovereignty, Cruel Punishment, and the Inhuman, The Future of Abolition, where I'm trying to work this out. And what I want to present tonight is some of the thinking that I've been doing there. The resources I bring to my study of abolition and the question of its future are the traditions that formed me: Marxism, deconstruction, feminism, psychoanalysis, and more recently, questions of historiography and method. I've thought a great deal about what I can bring to the project of abolition. I have been engaged in some activism and I've done some prison teaching, but that's not where my strengths lie. I'm a political theorist by training, so I speak to you tonight as an educator, a critic, and a theorist. So let me first speak as an educator. Because I teach political theory, I am regularly confronted by the task of encouraging students to be critical of the goods of liberalism. Interestingly, my students are pretty sanguine about the fact that those goods have lost their shine. They're not that sold on the goods of liberalism, and yet they don't want to let them go. They're not surprised to hear that because the narrative of progress, for instance, that undergirded so much 18th century political optimism in Europe, because it posits Europe as its center, it legitimates practices of colonialism and imperialism. They understand this, but nevertheless, despite these insights, my students are strongly convinced that these are the conceptual tools we need in order to make the world a better place. The alternative to this, they tell me, is political nihilism, political action without political hope. Wendy Brown has actually pointed towards this kind of conundrum, suggesting that one of the curious symptoms of the current moment is that despite our keen awareness of the ways that liberalism has not delivered on what it has promised, these are things we cannot not want. So the first question kind of animating this project was, how do we think about the moment we're in, which requires so much political critique, at the same time that it sustains political hope? If we are no longer asking, as Kant did in the 18th century, for what way may we hope, but rather, how might we think of hope in light of the full acknowledgement that tomorrow is, in fact, radically open? So I begin with the full acknowledgement that my students are my best teachers, and that I take their concerns about hope, and particularly hope about politics, very seriously. I'm actually teaching a course on abolition of democracy this term. In many senses, this presentation tonight is as much theirs as it is mine. Well, it's more mine, but it's theirs too. So this is a pretty famous quote from Mariam Kaba, who's a prison abolitionist. And I chose it to hang my presentation on tonight because my students loved it. And I loved that they loved it. I'm always interested in what they really respond to. And so I think a lot about how to understand what it is they loved about this. So it's an interesting statement because it's pretty far from the way that we usually think about hope. Usually we think of hope as a kind of a sentiment or a feeling, but to think of hope as a discipline, that's something quite different. I want to suggest that it's actually a really helpful way of thinking about the project of abolition in the tradition of abolition democracy. The saying, in other words, I think is powerful because it says something that is difficult and counterintuitive in a really compressed way, in a way that takes a long time to unpack in more analytical forms. So my argument is that the phrase hope is a discipline is a great way of getting at a definition of abolition democracy, the term that we inherit from W.E.B. Du Bois, from his magisterial work, Black Reconstruction. Let's see what this is. There he is. So what's specific about abolition democracy? On my reading, the term abolition democracy implies a radical set of understandings of political organizing, imagination, the capacities and limits of the democratic project, and historical change. That I am kind of telescoping here as hope is a discipline, or maybe just the future. My presentation isn't about Du Bois, but I want to tell you a little bit about how I understand by what he meant by abolition democracy. His object of study was the roughly 10-year period following the American Civil War. He provided a class and labor-centered analysis that explains the course of those revolutionary years by placing what he called the Black worker, aka the enslaved, at the center of his analysis of the shift from slave-based economies in the South based on the production of cotton to capitalist and industrial economies in the North. He tells the riveting story of how the formerly enslaved stole themselves in a move Du Bois names as a general strike. Close to 500,000 former slaves left their plantations and joined the Union Army. And this, of course, was decisive in winning a war that might otherwise have been lost. The period immediately following the war, known as Reconstruction, saw the establishment of the Freedmen's Bureau and a mighty push to meaningfully include the formerly enslaved in political, social, and economic life. The 13th, 14th, and 15th amendments, Janice was just referring to the 13th, of the American Constitution are those passed during that period. And this decisive moment entailed not just a destruction of slavery and the enfranchisement of the formerly enslaved, but also saw Black actors engaged in a radical revisioning of the public sphere and the conditions necessary for a good life in it. In this sense, for Du Bois, the Black worker can be seen to have used one of the central levers of democracy, which is its capacity to include more and more into the category of the people. We have seen this revolutionary capacity for transformation at work in every great attempt to include more and more. In this case, the formerly enslaved, but of course also pushes to include the propertyless, Blacks, women, Indigenous people, and so on into the category of those formerly excluded from the category citizen. I don't know, random photo. Du Bois's term, abolition democracy, is one that calls not just for the abolition of slavery, it was a call for the abolition of slavery in terms of something else, democracy. Formally, of course, that meant, at the very least, citizenship and the right to vote, but also, as I said, the meaningful inclusion of the freedmen in governing themselves. As they came to see, this also meant the daunting political project of creating the conditions for millions of new citizens to take up their places in political, civil, and economic life. Because they had been treated for generations as objects of labor, as property, and as subhuman, that project involved education as a political right and a massive redistribution of wealth, first in the form of the withdrawal of free labor and in the contest over the literal redistribution of land and people. As we know, democracy means, as I've said, ruling directed by the will of the people, the demos. But what can and has come under pressure is what or who the people includes. Over the last several hundred years, much of what we call politics has been aimed at opening up who can claim citizenship and the rights associated with it. This is because in its very structure, democracy is indefinitely open to possibilities of transformation. In an important way, then, democracy is never something that is present in a simple way, given once and for all. It is, as Jacques Derrida has argued, always to come, in the sense that we can never be sure that all who might be included have now been so in a meaningful way. They might still be coming. At the same time, democracy is also necessarily fragile, because it is always open to the possibility of its own destruction or distortion. Democracy is not a final state of perfect reconciliation that we must indefinitely strive towards. It is, as democracy to come, the infinite open-endedness of a project whose continuation is never certain. Because what makes possible its continuation is also what makes it possible its demise, which is its exposure to the incalculability of the demos, or the people. Democracy, in other words, includes both movements and actions that increase the number and extent of voices being involved in ruling, but also movements and actions that can or might undermine democracy itself. And of course, there's many examples, but we don't have to look very far, as we are here looking anxiously to the nation to our south that is skating perilously to just such a fate. The capacity for democracy to undermine itself is built then into the concept of democracy itself. A democracy that permitted only changes that furthered the cause of democracy and prohibited democratic votes that called for the introduction of non-democratic forms of government would actually be undemocratic. A pure or perfect democracy that was finally established once and for all, such that it was no longer possible for it to abolish itself via its own democratic process, would also not be a democracy. The ideal case of democracy in the classical sense is the state that perfectly coincides with its concept would not be democracy. The ideal case of democracy would have to involve its openness to the possibility of really radical transformation. So perhaps we could, in principle, one day find ourselves in the utopian position of having eliminated all non-democratic sentiments in a society where literally everyone wanted to continue democracy. These are the kinds of thought experiments people really like. I find them odd, but anyway. And perhaps all empirical possibilities of generating non-democratic sentiments and desires would be eliminated. Still, this utopian society would only be democratic if it still allowed its demos the freedom to vote for non-democratic laws, etc., if it was still exposed to the possibility of what Derrida calls autoimmune violence. So democracy is then always at war with itself, never capable of fully resolving its inner tensions and contradictions. So that to come here, the fact that it's always coming, is not in the positing of some horizon or possibility for democracy, as it were just a kind of an idea in the Platonic or the regulative Kantian sense. But the to come expresses actually the dislocation that structures the very possibility of democracy from within. And it's this very possibility for democracy to be undermined by itself that precisely was at work in Du Bois' account of the counter-revolution that saw the end of Reconstruction. Because, of course, if the history Du Bois recounts is one in which, for a while, Black freedmen gained a stake in state governments, the failure of what he calls abolition democracy, what he clearly signals as a counter-revolution, was that this engagement with the state did not amount to enough to disempower Southern white supremacists and Northern capitalists. This was a cross-class alliance, which ultimately united to first overthrow Reconstruction governments and then spread the myth that Black government would always amount to corrupt and lawless government. The counter-revolution, begun in 1877, involved, on the one hand, what Du Bois called was a failure of class solidarity between Black and white workers. But it also included an unexpected set of solidarities. Bernard Harker puts it this way: the counter-revolution against Reconstruction was most clearly signaled by the American elite, the ruling elite, setting out to build, brick by brick, a criminal justice system that reproduced slavery in a different form, the punitive society. Black codes and labor restrictions gave rise to new forms of slavery, protected by the exceptions clause in the 13th Amendment. These laws and restrictions were part of a set of clear and constant political decisions, which have delivered today what has been called hyper-racialized mass incarceration. So it's maybe not a surprise that so many contemporary prison abolitionists take up the term abolition democracy in their analysis of racialized mass incarceration. If the project of ending slavery is incomplete in the US, it is because it has been continued through the criminalization of the poor and the organized abandonment and impoverishment of the racialized. In Ruth Wilson Gilmore's words, racism is the state-sanctioned and/or extra-legal production and exploitation of group differentiation, vulnerability to premature death. In the United States, in particular, mass incarceration has increasingly functioned as for-profit industry and as a solution to health and social problems, such as drug addiction and mental illness. It was no accident that the protests of the summer of 2020 demanded that public funds be rerouted from inflated policing and incarceration costs back to communities and organizations serving vulnerable people. The point to be emphasized here is that the loud, large, and sustained protests we saw in the summer of 2020 included the call for decarceration and demilitarizing the police because the conditions that gave rise to them laid bare and rejected the systemic inequalities that underpinned that democracy. These movements, from Reconstruction in the 19th century to what some call the Second Reconstruction, in the form of the Civil Rights Movement in the 60s and the 70s, into the most recent political organizing, all work in one way or another in the tradition of abolition democracy that Du Bois outlined in the 1930s. So if hope is a discipline and thus a practice, it's not just a practice of political action. It's also, as praxis, the practice of study, of scholarship, and careful attention to the past and to history. And Du Bois was a historian. Faced with a received history of Reconstruction that he saw was deeply wrong, not just in moral and political terms, but also in historical ones, he set out to tell a different story. So until the 1950s, really, long after the publication of Black Reconstruction, both scholarly and popular understandings of the Reconstruction era following the Civil War were dominated by the so-called Dunning School, who were the first generation of historians of the era at the turn of the century in Columbia University. On their view, Reconstruction was a travesty of democracy, an era of corruption and misgovernment. For them, the freedmen, either from genetic inferiority or maybe childishness, they had a propensity for being manipulated. And so they were incapable of properly exercising the political rights that Congress had given them. And so on this view, Reconstruction was understood to be the lowest point in the saga of American history. Now, this is a position that wasn't just reflected in academic historical research. The perspective was loudly echoed in the wildly popular, for instance, film Birth of a Nation, which glorified the Klan and presented Blacks as uncivilized savages. The underlying principles of these works, scholarly and popular, was the assumption of Black incapacity. This was the widespread history and set of prejudices that Du Bois set out to counter. Remarkably, Du Bois wrote the history of the decade of Reconstruction using almost all the same scholarly resources from the Dunning School. He had a modest research grant, and as a Black man, he had limited access to the archives. So he was, in fact, forced to use pretty much the same set of materials. By simply putting what he called the Black worker at the center of the story, his recounting of history saw the Reconstruction era as the high water mark in American history. One historical account, popular and widely accepted for decades, was that the period known as, in US history known as Reconstruction, was the lowest moment in American history, and the other, now widely accepted, claimed it as the high water mark in American democracy. I think I forgot to change the slide. There's the book. The method Du Bois used is historical materialism, whose usual definition is it's a way of thinking about history that begins with the question of material conditions. How do people create and recreate their conditions of existence? How do they make food? How do they distribute it? How do they make shelter? How do they make families? And so on. It begins, in other words, from material conditions, which is why labor is at the center of the equation. But it's also one in which every economic system is organized through a contest between the class that rules and the class that is ruled. And those two classes are in constant, if not always self-conscious struggle, where the class that rules attempts to take wealth from those it rules over, etc. It's a mode of historical analysis, in other words, for which the key question is, how is the class struggle doing? Using this method for Du Bois, the Reconstruction period was best understood as a conflict among classes that were struggling to find new ways of surviving after the demise of the slave economy. Now, there are lots of reasons that Du Bois is known both as a historian and as a poet. And that is not just because he's a beautiful writer, although he is. Black Reconstruction is a dauntingly long book, but the soaring prose makes it a pleasure to read. And while it is beautifully written and meticulously researched, it is also a work of enormous vision and imagination. It took a great act of imagination to read the movement of Black workers fleeing their conditions to join the Union Army as a general strike. Now, much ink has been spilled over whether his use of the idea of the general strike to describe this migration was legitimate or historically accurate, but this controversy doesn't interest me at all. What interests me is the perspective from which it becomes possible to see it as such. And here I'm inspired by literary critic Gayatri Spivak, whose work on Du Bois is, she's been engaged with Du Bois for quite a long time, and she's much better placed to think this thought than I am. But she has called the invocation of the general strike, Du Bois's use of that term, Du Bois's dream. Not a dream in the psychoanalytic sense, as a text in need of interpretation, but in the much more prosaic sense, that dreams are simply the thoughts that we have while we're sleeping. And as we all know, what we think while we are sleeping often slips out of the bounds of the purely evidentiary. And so she uses this idea of Du Bois's dream to talk about how, with the idea of the general strike, Du Bois pushed the figurative beyond the bounds of the strictly speaking historically permissible in order to make an important political point. That is, he takes a bold narrative structure, the general strike, a concept he borrows from the 1905 Russian general strike or from the writings of the Wobblies with which he was familiar, in order to describe the self-interested activity of millions of enslaved people watching and waiting as their masters were awake at the front to seize their moment and liberate themselves. It's a massive insight, and it changes the direction of his work and lends political dignity to what must have been millions of individual desperate struggles. This idea of the general strike is the mode by which Du Bois describes how self-interested subjects came to be the spirit of a world-making and citizens of a democratic future. So what does it mean to take inspiration from the future? Marx makes this point in the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, a text in which Marx investigates a different failed revolution, that of France in 1848. In that almost, I think, perfect little text, Marx points out that the French revolutionaries of 1789 adopted the garb of the Roman Republic as they demanded freedom, equality, and liberty. As he put it, these 18th century struggles dressed themselves up literally in the clothing of antiquity, and so they took their inspiration from the past. But he claimed the social revolutions of the 19th century could not be backward looking, but must be inspired by a moment that has not yet happened, but was promised. This is just Marx. The social revolutions of the 19th century cannot take its poetry from the past, but only from the future. It cannot begin with itself before it has stripped away all superstition about that past. The former revolutions required recollections of past world history in order to smother their own content. The revolution of the 19th century must let the dead bury their dead in order to arrive at its own content. Now, I've thought quite a lot about this call to be inspired by the poetry of the future, since this is a text I've often taught. And it seems to me to be an apt way to describe the very form or strategy of abolition democracy. The magnificent movement forward that Du Bois described required not only a backward-looking negative moment of abolition, the abolition of slavery, but also a forward-looking positive moment of world historic collective self-activity, abolition democracy. And to do this, he borrowed a concept, a metaphor, or a dream. In making use of this narrative structure, I think that works, Du Bois evidenced both the explosive capacities of democracy and the world-changing nature of politics. And at the same time, his work exposes the fragility of democracy and, of course, of politics itself. A narrative of structure that understands the material limits to political change is, of course, Raymond Williams' term for a structure of feeling. And Williams argued that every age has several different structures of feeling that are in some sort of contest. Each of them, however, express in their narrative form the limits for what can be thought to be change or changeable. So one could even say that one of the structures of feeling of our current moment is one in which it becomes impossible to think about the end of prisons. By working with the image or the historical referent of the general strike, Du Bois stepped out of the narrative structure of the 19th century and made use of one that understood the material limits to political change otherwise. So let me come back here to the quote from Mariam Kaba that my students loved. Hope, captured here by the image that Trent used for this presentation, is the mad practice of loving the future. It's a mad practice because it's impossible to love what is not yet. But despite the fact that it's a mad practice, hope happens anyway. Indeed, we can imagine the desperate hope that propelled enslaved people out of their situations toward an uncertain future. And we can maybe imagine the rising hope of the freedmen having a say in their state governments, working to hold a constitution that claimed that all men are created equal to its own unthought promise. And maybe we can imagine the hope for a world in which the solution to the problem of poverty and racism, the social problems of that day and ours, is not the creation of more and more jails, but rather a solution grounded in the dramatic and explosive possibilities opened up by democracy. Political hope, our love for the future, for whatever tomorrow. But the question is, for what tomorrow? That is the political question. And Mariam Kaba tells it what it consists of: discipline. It's a practice, and a committed one. Hope is something we can and must do now. And as we know, the dream of abolition democracy was only partially fulfilled. So its legacy rests on our shoulders. Thank you.